Welcome back to our series on short story writing.
Now, the first thing I would advise you to tell your child as you guide your child is to think of the story as a product.
Okay.
Don't think of it as a chore, as a task, as teacher's work, as something I have to do, but
Right.
think of it as a
product.
product.
All right.
And if it's a product, then it is aimed at an audience.
Okay.
And mainly, a short story serves to entertain an audience, or
Right.
readers or listeners. They entertain. Sometimes there are other aims, as we said earlier, passing on certain values, causing people to reflect, but primarily,
It's
in
for
in many
entertainment.
cases, to entertain.
All right.
And so, if it is meant to engage an audience, who would want to buy a boring or commonplace story if we're thinking of it as a product, metaphorically?
Right.
All right?
And since it has no cover for you to look at to see if it's interesting, how can she get her story to be very interesting?
Well, that's what we're coming to. So, there are many ideas that I have here, many aspects that you can help your student through to make the story interesting.
Okay.
Now, before we get to that,
Okay.
let us look at some elements of a good story,
Oh.
because this is the first thing in making the story a
Yes.
real story in the
Right.
first place.
Right.
So, a story must have an interesting plot or storyline,
Okay.
meaning that the student should plan an overall idea of a story from start to finish, like a skeletal frame of the story.
So it'd be good to use a graphic organizer to get this
Wow,
done.
you said you're a mathematician, but
Yes, I am.
listening to you, you sound like you're a language expert, man.
Well, I try.
You try.
Yes.
Well, very good. I must congratulate you.
Thank you.
So, the story must have an interesting plot. We don't
Okay.
want commonplace stories about you brushing your teeth and walking and looking at flowers.
Right.
You know, I always say to students, when you come in and say, "Girl, I have a story," somebody doesn't want to hear that you went to bed and woke up.
Oh no.
Not at all.
Right.
They are looking for something
Something.
out of the ordinary.
Right.
So every story should have a conflict or a problem.
All right.
And when we say conflict or problem, some students think people always have to be fighting,
Fighting.
or arguing or so. But conflict, as we will show in other aspects of whether in part one here or in other segments of the presentation, a conflict can come in varied forms.
Oh, okay.
So once the character faces some kind of challenge or something that he or she has to overcome, whether mentally, socially, emotionally, physically, spiritually, or otherwise, then it becomes a conflict.
Okay.
A captivating beginning.
Okay.
Readers or listeners are not going to continue paying attention or reading or listening to a story which starts out in a very boring, dull way.
You know, miss, that is a very big problem. I don't know how to do that, and I don't think she knows how to do that either. You know, most times she'll begin by saying once upon a time
Right, and we
or
know
one day.
and there are many reasons for this.
Okay.
And one way you can help your child here, your child must read. They must see how other readers express themselves.
Right.
You can talk with your child about the start of a movie that captivates interest.
Okay.
What happened in the start?
Right.
Was the character moving, running, trying to get away from somebody,
Right.
looking stressed,
Right.
voicing something, and you can talk with your child about it. But also actual texts.
So these are like meta text.
Right. So in
Okay.
actual text, there are samples that show how good writers captivate their readers or listeners in the
Right.
beginning.
Okay.
Of course, action and or deep thought. So one good way, as I said before, is to have action. A story should move.
Okay.
And so we use up the vocabulary that allows our stories to move. So a story should develop. A story should not remain in one scene or looking at one thought or one idea. So a story should transition.
Okay.
The character should be believable.
Right.
So we don't want to have characters doing things that are in the cartoons because, you know, we want or people to believe the story. Well, if it's a sci-fi,
Okay.
you know, so if it is science fiction or something that allows the unbelievable, but if the child is attempting to represent reality, then the characters should be believable. When they become
Could you give me an example of that?
all right. So, for example, when you are nervous, when somebody is nervous, how do you know they are nervous?
They're shaking.
They're shaking.
right.
Things may fall out of
Or
their hand.
sweating.
They're sweating profusely.
Right.
So
Okay.
when the student writes, we want to see those. We don't just want you to tell us that the
Okay.
character was nervous.
Okay.
We
Okay.
want you to show us
okay, through words.
through words,
Okay.
so that the reader or the listener can begin to deduce, to
Okay.
use also their imagination,
Right.
or to create visual imagery or images as they read.
Right. Right.
Suspense must be in a good story.
Oh.
So you don't tell us everything just then. The man caught the lady. You know,
Okay.
how did he catch her? He heard the sound. You know, she heard him coming, but she tried to push in the drawer. But, you know, he was already at the door. Her heart was beating. You know, so that's
Interesting.
how suspense, that's how we engage and hold the attention of a reader. And of course, what is more is having an interesting or surprising end to a story.
Okay. Could you give me an example of an interesting start?
So one example that I think we have further down was it, they were still coming. All my energy was spent. I was out of breath, gasping. I could feel my heart beating out of my chest. It thundered like an explosive sound, too close for comfort. You know, I mean, that was
Right.
just off the top
All
of my
right,
head.
all
It could be
right.
better.
Great.
Right? But at the beginning, it should grab
Right.
attention.
It did grab my
It
attention.
grabbed your
Yes,
attention.
it did.
So stories should end with an interesting or surprising sentence or statement or idea.
So sometimes you do things that the reader didn't expect. So I recall a story where people were standing below a building. A man was upstairs and they were negotiating with him not to drop something,
Right.
right? That would have caused some great disaster. And, you know, they were there negotiating, and the writer led us to think that this man wasn't going to do it. And then it just said, and he dropped to them. And we held our hearts,
Yes,
our chest.
Definitely.
It's like, he really dropped to them. So that's an unexpected ending.
Right.
Let's take a break and we'll be right back.